So it's now my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. John McGrath. Dr. McGrath teaches project management at the Dublin Institute of Technology. He is also a guest lecturer at the Smurfit Business School, at the University College Dublin Engineering School, Trinity College in Dublin, and also Brunel University in London, UK. Dr. McGrath, thank you for joining us from Ireland this morning, this afternoon, your time. Really appreciate your interest, and I'll hand the podium over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're stateside. Thanks for the nice introduction there, Tom. So essentially what I would like to share with you over the next hour or so is some lessons learned in terms of the last 20 years that I've spent working as a project management consultant and also teaching up to MBA and up to PhD level, and a lot of the opportunity that I get from teaching is actually learning from students who have their own experiences as well. I should also say medical devices is a huge industry here in Ireland. We have more people employed in medical devices per capita than any other country bar Sweden in Ireland. So it's actually a massive industry we have here. We have a huge amount of American multinational companies who have a presence in Europe. I think our collective efforts between our international counterparts in the workplace, we tend to have earned a reputation, I think, internationally with our workforces here in delivering project success. And I've had the privilege of working on a number of those projects with international teams, and essentially that's what I would like to share with you. Just to fill in maybe a couple little points in terms of my own experience. So I've been working in projects for about 20 years at this stage. So I started originally as a teacher, and I think teaching and project management, they're quite similar. Very often part of the role of a project manager is as a communicator and as that of a mentor. So I think my early days of working as what you guys would call a high school, we call a secondary school over here, teacher, gave me a very good foundation stone which I built on. I haven't worked extensively in medical devices, but I have worked quite a lot in the pharmaceutical industry. I spent quite a number of years with Wyatt Pharmaceuticals. They have a presence here in Ireland. They're now owned by Pfizer, which I'm sure a lot of people will be aware of. And essentially my role there was as a project planner for basically putting together large-scale corporate projects across the plant. It was going through a massive expansion phase at the time. We had about 1,500 people on site. As Tom has mentioned, I also have taught in quite a number of universities. I've also worked for the United Nations as a planning consultant in terms of tracking carbon credits globally. Medical devices, obviously, you're heavily involved in manufacturing, and in the last number of years I've actually worked quite a bit in terms of plant optimization, in terms of introducing Lean Six Sigma initiatives as well into organizations. I've also worked as a planning consultant for the London and Rio Olympic Games in terms of planning the events. And as you can see there, I've a wealth of other experience as well in terms of that field. So everything from manufacturing to heavy engineering to IT, essentially, I've worked on. In terms of the topic this afternoon, or this morning, should I say, for you guys, essentially I want to address what I would consider to be the elephant in the room in terms of project failure. So there's been massive improvements in project management over the last 20 years, but the one issue that we seem not to be able to address is that of project failure. So regardless of where you look at the research, there's almost a concept or a belief that about 50% of projects fail, and I suppose I want to give you my take on it, and I believe there are sometimes very subtle changes we can make in organizations that will have a massive impact on our success rate in projects. I think it's very important to also understand that the modern era of project management probably doesn't go back much more than 20 years. If we take into account the likes of the home of project management, which really is in kind of heavy engineering, construction, military, space exploration, those type of industries, really in terms of project management coming into mainstream across all organizations, I think it's only happened in the last 20 years. In my own sort of research, I would look at Y2K. So a lot of people will be familiar with the Y2K. I'll just move on a slide here for a second. And I think this Y2K is very much the birth of the modern era of project management. This really was the first time that we had project management in terms of contingency planning and understanding of risk. It came all the way to the boardroom table as organizations prep for Y2K. So as we know, that's only less than 17 years ago, so it's quite recent in organizations' memory. I suppose the downside of that is we saw organizations went to great length to plan very effectively, and to a large extent that effort was unfounded, you know, in terms of that there wasn't really the crisis that we thought in terms of how Y2K was built up. I think that sort of huge effort in planning and not seeing a return on it has also left some scars in organizations, and that's part of the reason now we have this obsession with execution. Just go and do it, as opposed to putting the effort into planning these things out more effectively. I think you can actually track the last 20 years in project management relatively easy. So if we look at 20 years ago, it was, you know, typically owned by construction engineering, little PM interest from corporate systems. So in terms of the different technology solutions we have, both at a project, program, portfolio level, that's everything from Microsoft Project to Primavera to Project Vision to, there's probably 100 different tools that we have out there at the moment. I always think that a real test of the interest in project management in your own organization, if you look back to 20 years ago, I would bet my right arm that you had a HR director, you had a manufacturing director, you had a finance director, you had a sales director, but you probably didn't have in your organization a projects director. And I think that's kind of showing how things have changed. And nowadays in most organizations we have a projects director. We may even have a lean or a continuous improvement director as well. And obviously we know that continuous improvement is very much driven by project initiatives. The other kind of major factor after that, I think, is the Windows 95, Microsoft releasing a Windows 95. I think that's also another foundation stone of the modern era of project management. Software vendors almost don't know how easy they have it nowadays. They put a version up on the web and people download it, and that's the end of it. But I'm sure there's lots of people online who can remember the days of getting a CD and a book translated into every language in the world, and it was posted out and released at the same time. If we look into the 2000-2007 era, and I think a lot of this was driven by manufacturing organizations in the concept of a center for excellence. So part of that drive for excellence in project management is organizations realized that we needed to set up a PMO. As we move into the kind of more recent era, 2007-2009, and I think there's a massive factor there, is this is probably the first time that we moved away from this obsession with tools and techniques and processes, and we really recognize that it's people who deliver projects, not anything else. That really, so our successful projects, even technical projects, comes down to that people, that human interaction. In the global crisis of 2007-2010, I think certainly organizations were in survival mode, but in the more recent era, then we moved to 2010, 2016, there's a whole range of factors. I think very significantly, we all recognize that delivering on time, on budget is no longer enough to measure success by. And the other massive change we've seen in the last 6 years is the kind of wide stream adaptation of agile technology. So I think these are, you know, in terms of a 20-year period, I think we can actually map out exactly what has happened. And I think we need to actually understand that transition in terms of the different periods, in terms of how we approach projects in the modern era. And I think this is probably very fundamental. We now recognize that project management is a combination of hard and soft skills. So we often talk about the art and the science of project management, and we now realize that we need both, that it's not just tools and techniques, that you need people skills as well. And I think it's that sort of harmonization of the skill set has had a massive impact on project success in many respects, and certainly in advances of project management, but we still haven't addressed the issue of failure. In terms of how I would see project success being assessed in this day and age, I think we actually have 5 criteria of success. Once upon a time, on budget was golden, and that was sufficient. But I think in the wider definition of success within an organization, we have 3 additional, and those are: we have to meet the technical specifications associated with the project. Your project has to deliver to quality. We have to meet the business case, so there has to be a return on investment on the project. And a massive issue that I'm sure we're all aware of is the modern era of the importance of stakeholder and recognizing stakeholders, and that these are the individuals or the groups who can have a massive impact on pushing your project towards success or failure. Often the issue is that we fail to actually recognize who are the stakeholders with influence, and that is often sometimes reacting to stakeholders too late, you often have to build a relationship with people in good times in order to be able to deal with things in troubled times. So I think that's very important that we now have 5 pillars of success that we have to look at in our projects. I think there's some very interesting stats in project management. So PMI estimate that in the 5-year space, let's say between 2015 to 2020, or maybe 2017 to 2022, but they actually see 15 million new project management roles globally. So I think this is more and more that organizations recognize that if you want to drive continuous improvement, if you want to drive innovation, if you want to execute strategy, you've got to do it through projects. So I think that's a very mature upside, I suppose, to how we're adopting project management within organizations. The downside, which is what we're here to talk about, is that the average project has a 43% cost overrun. If we look there, only 64% of projects meet their goals, so that's research from PMI. If I look at the Harvard Business Review, they actually drop it down to about 40%. We also see 44% of organizations use no software or PM tool. I think that's a very interesting stat when the webinar this afternoon is being sponsored by Cora Systems, who have a tool for managing projects and programs. And I think a massive disadvantage, and it still hits about 50% of organizations, that they're trying to use a spreadsheet tool for managing projects, programs, and portfolios. And I think that really is an uphill battle when organizations are doing that. Probably the frightening stat of all is that 70% of IT executives believe their project are doomed from the start. So if that's really the sunshine days, is the early days of the project, ideally we should have some control on them, but if we're looking at an anticipated failure of 70% from day one, I think that can only get worse as things go forward. So unfortunately, that is the reality of where we're at in terms of projects. I think that how projects fail, there's no mystery about that. So if we take a look at the reasons why projects fail, typical examples is stakeholder. We've recognized more and more the importance of stakeholder. We've talked about that. Project sponsorship, I think, is a huge issue in terms of the role of a sponsor in an organization. I think a sponsor needs to become far more hands-on. We have this concept in the likes of the project management body of knowledge, or even in a lot of organizations and how they operate, that they see the project sponsor as somebody who's a little bit aloof to the project. I believe the sponsor has to get more hands-on and involved in driving the success of the project, and also ensuring that the organization is fully supporting it. We're aware of the business case, so we know that the project must produce a return on investment. We always talk about continued business justification. Is the project worthwhile? Planning and risk, I think, is at the heart of project management. Nobody sets out to do a bad job, but the hard and facts are that 50% of projects fail. Communication's massive issue. We hear stats that 90% of a project manager's effort is in communication. That's probably a little high, but certainly it's a massive issue. Team leadership, my own take on that is that actually is about trust. You've got to build trust amongst your team, amongst your leadership, and obviously with your project sponsor as well. Resource factors is still proving to be an issue in project failure. In my own personal experience, I find that unacceptable. I think in this day and age, with the amount of tools we have, that we can very easily see future resource demands, both in terms of capacity and in capability, and there's no excuse in this modern era of not having resources for a project. My own take on that is that typically what happens is there's a competition between the organization, the operations part of the business, and the project, and typically what happens, both want to resource at the same time, and the business as usual, the operations part of the business gets the resource and the project has to wait. And I think that comes back to the sponsor needs to take a more hands-on role in ensuring that if resources have been committed to a project, that they should deliver. Managing change, we all know that projects are full of change. In fact, it's the only guarantee is that your project plan is going to change right from the word go. And I think our ability to manage change comes back to our understanding of planning and risk. So essentially, these are always the issues that people tell us our project failed typically because of one or some of these. Typically, we can actually, with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that these issues were bubbling away under the surface, and we could have probably done something about it if we reacted sooner. Now, while we understand what's happening here in terms of how projects fail, I think the fundamental issue is what is the root cause, and this is what organizations find difficult to address. We all understand how projects fail, but the issue is what is the root cause, and equally important, why is it that organizations can't learn from the mistakes of the past? So we continue to fail at a rate of about 50%. Now, in terms of why that happens, I think we've got to change our definition of project success. So it's very common in an organization that when they assess success, they talk about the project team. My own understanding is that a project team on its own cannot deliver success. So what we essentially need is we need the organization to support that. So when we talk about project success, we should look for certainly the project team, but we should also look for the business itself. How is the organization supporting the project? And also, very importantly, how is the project governance team? How is the project sponsor actually driving success? So if we were to assess a project under these 3 criteria, I think it would have a massive impact on our rate. There's this tendency that we can blame the project team if it fails, but if projects are about change in an organization, everyone has to be involved in that. The other things we talk about is in project governance. So I think project governance, that we have to take a whole new way of looking at project governance. We need senior management support. Projects drive change in an organization, but the change has to be driven up to the senior management team. The reality is that when we select people on a project governance role, typically they have no training or project management qualifications for that. And I think in doing that, we're actually creating a culture that doesn't support change, which is what projects are all about. The other issue as well, I think, is that very often project teams have a clear lack of understanding of what the role or responsibilities they have in terms of project management. And that is not just my own opinion. If I actually take a look at research by PwC, and if we take a look at health, pharma and life sciences, governance enabling is a massive issue in terms of project management, and it's actually across all industries. And I think it comes back to that issue that while we're advancing all the time in our project management tools and techniques, we're not actually really moving beyond holding responsibility at the door of the project team only. So we've got to change that quite. I think what happens is when we fail to do that, the output of this is that we have project governance teams that find it difficult to make decisions. So I think it's very important that we look at this. Otherwise, we have this concept of almost a project freezing indecision where decisions can't be made to support initiatives. So to come back to this idea of projects driving change in an organization, I would look at the business as usual, the operations day-to-day of the business, and the projects where they exist at an individual level. They essentially are working down the ground in the front line of an organization. In terms of, you cannot drive that change horizontal, so you cannot drive across and say, well, projects are going to influence business as usual. I think you have to drive that up into the program, up into the portfolio, and right up into your executive board. And it's the executive board support that drives the change down across the organization. So and that is the problem. If we don't have project governance, projects will only ever exist in a silo or in a vacuum, and they won't actually drive change within the organization. Another massive issue that I've seen time and time again is that typically senior leadership teams take the greatest interest in a project in the execution stage. This is typically when we're spending a lot of money and we're using a lot of resources in the organization, and the senior leadership teams start to take notice. I think the issue is that we need to get senior leadership teams involved far earlier. Really at the project initiation stage, right at the beginning, we should have senior leadership team support. And the idea being that the senior leadership team needs to exist at the beginning, and it needs to exist the whole way through the project. So I think that's very important. If you look in your organization, when do we really get the senior leadership team involved? And if we can do that earlier, I think those people have a huge amount of experience and knowledge, and we need to get that on board at the early stages, in the planning stages of projects. I always kind of look, when I look at a project sponsor and a project manager, and I often kind of get this sense that they're not working in harmony, that there's almost a bit of resistance to it. I've also seen quite on a lot of occasions that you'll find that the project team and the project sponsor will never actually meet together on an individual basis, that the only time a project team will meet their sponsors at a project review, maybe at the end of a month or something like that, and essentially the project sponsor is getting involved in assessing, a RAG, red, amber, green analysis of how the project is progressing. I think project success is about creating this synergy between your project manager and your project sponsor. Almost in the same way when we see an air traffic controller and a pilot, they work together. They work in harmony to bring the plane down successfully or to land it. And I suppose in the same way I looked at the sponsor and the project manager, they need to work together to deliver the project safely. There can't be this sense of each working in a silo, but there should be kind of continuous communication and continuous feedback between the two of them. The other thing as well, which surprises me a lot, is organizations have this obsession with the business case, and they tend to assess the business case very early in the project. They want to essentially, how much is the project going to cost? Is there a return on investment on it? But the issue is, very often they're actually assessing the business case before they've actually done a full work breakdown structure, before they've done a full analysis of what's required. And the problem with doing that is, all your estimates are only that. They are poor estimates. Really what we need to do, we need to almost shift this concept that we do the business case at some stage in the planning, not at the initiation stage, more in the planning when we've got a much greater visibility, and in that way we can get a far more accurate reading on terms of return on investment. If you do the business case too early, it's the equivalent almost of asking a taxi driver to agree the final fare and how long it's going to take, but you can't actually give them a clear definition of where it is you want to get to. So we can understand that doesn't make a lot of sense in our day-to-day living, but organizations are essentially doing that if they bring the business case far too earlier in the project assessment process. The other thing too is I'm amazed by how organizations fail to get the fundamentals right. So this kind of basic concept of a work breakdown structure, which is really something we kind of cover in any project management course. In lesson 1, week 1, we explain the importance of a WBS, work breakdown structure. I'm a big fan of this, and not just because it gives you visibility of the work that has to be done, but I always look at the work breakdown structure as being level 1, but then if you actually look at it, when you have clear visibility of what's ahead of you, it's very easy to do a resource breakdown structure. You can assess what resources do we need to deliver each of these work packages. When you understand the work package and you understand the resource loading, it's very easy for you to understand the cost. So you can do a cost breakdown structure. And if we take that further, when you have clear visibility of the road ahead, you can now do a RBS, a risk breakdown structure, and you can actually assess the risks that are with your project as well. So I think it's very important that when we do a work breakdown structure, we don't leave it at that. We do a cost breakdown structure, resource breakdown structure, and a risk breakdown structure based on that simple, very effective initiative. The other thing that I'm a huge fan of is the whiteboard. I think we don't use these things. Technology is brilliant, but if you really want to brainstorm and get that technical knowledge people have in their head, you need something like a whiteboard, and this is really a fundamental planning tool. I'm always a little bit disappointed when I don't see lots of kind of lessons learned or screenshots taken of whiteboards like this here, because I think that's a real storming and forming and actually really doing root cause analysis of what it takes to deliver success in a project. The other thing I also think is if we don't know how long it's going to take, we shouldn't guess. So 3-point estimating is a very effective technique where essentially we look at optimistic, pessimistic, and most likely, and the whole idea is that by assessing that on each work package or each task, we end up with a more balanced view. Yes, everything could go well, or everything could go to be a complete disaster. Typically what happens is some things go well, some things don't, not so well, but by using 3-point estimating, it means we tend not to be so dramatically off. Typically what people do in a project is they have a certain love for the project, they want the project to go ahead, and we have a natural bias where we're overly optimistic in how long it's going to take and how much it's going to cost. So I think that's sort of the assumption we should have, is that when somebody is assessing a project, they are probably taking the more optimistic view, and sometimes we have to bring a bit of hard logic in and look at realistically, if something went wrong, what could go wrong, what impact would it have on our project. The other thing too is that is incredibly important is this concept of failing early. I think we have to embrace failure in projects. The sooner we fail, the sooner we move on to the more successful projects. we save our resources, we save our money. So I think it's very important that if you should have a stage gate review process in your project planning, and very importantly, part of that gate review is you should continue to ask, is the project still worthwhile? Do we still have continued business justification to continue with this project? And obviously the reason we have to do that is the longer you push it forward, the more money it's going to cost. So failing early is essentially probably one of the greatest strategies we can have in terms of managing our resources and managing our money most effectively. So I think it's very important we do that. My own opinion is that organizations struggle with this, especially if a project is suggested by someone on the senior leadership team. We tend to try and hold on to these projects and keep delivering them, even though the chances of a success are very, very slim. Sometimes too the business has moved on or the market has moved on, and through nobody's fault, it's still prudent to actually cancel the project and move on to something else, but organizations struggle with this sort of emotional attachment to projects and teams. A big gripe I have is on percentage complete. I think that when we report by percentage complete, I think it's never accurate. If we often hear about in project management or in operations management the concept of the 80-20 rule or the Pareto principle. So my understanding is that when 90% of the work is done, in the final 10%, 90% of the complexity is still there. So when you say you're 90% complete, I think that's never the case. If you actually take a typical project on a 4-week, week 1 we're told 25%, week 2 50%, week 3 75%, week 4 there's a problem. So I think it's this percentage complete is too soft. It's too it's lacking that objectivity that we need in assessing project progress. So personally I don't use it at all. I look for more robust ways, and part of that is by having a good plan and having a good project management information system that will allow you to assess progress under a number of factors. So sometimes I use milestone reporting, I use critical path analysis, and I might use earned value management as well to keep an eye on the cost side of things. The other thing too is that I'm always amazed by, and as somebody who teaches project management, and I use all the different techniques out there, and I'm teaching people how to do waterfall, agile, the importance of critical path, critical chain, introducing a lean project management, etc. But the big issue is that we're obsessed with methodologies and processes. The real issue, project success, is always about people. It's that people factor. Even in technical projects, if there's a technical problem, we need good people skills, we need good interaction, we need trust between our teams. So it's amazing when we look at the likes of PMBOK, which I think is an excellent reference document, but really it has the emphasis on 60% technical, 40% at most on the people side of it. So I think we have to move a little bit away from this obsession with tools and templates and checklists, and we need to almost develop a more open communication. Proper team development is what we need to drive success in projects. The other thing too is we got to make sure is we're getting our portfolio right. So we understand project is an individual project, one-off event. When we talk about a program, it's a group of related projects. But I think managing the portfolio, so portfolio management is essentially making sure we've got the right strategic mix across all our projects. So I think it's very important that we need to shape our portfolio much better. So projects, there's this kind of almost still working in a vacuum, working in isolation, but we need that helicopter view of our projects. But I think it's very important that the knowledge is working both ways. I think a massive issue for big organizations is in succession planning as people leave. And we also can have massive initiatives happening down at the project level, but they're not feeding up into our project management office. So I always look for knowledge transfer. Show me examples in your organization where initiatives down at the project level are being captured back up into the strategic view of your projects and are being shared amongst all your other projects. Organizations who have a PMO typically struggle with that. They're very good at pushing things down, but they're not so good at actually taking the lessons learned, taking the knowledge transfer up from the project and dispersing it across the organization. The other thing that we want our PMO to get right is the whole area of project selection. So conceptually, this is how I like to think it should look. We should have all these ideas going into our project selection, and not all of them come into our project pipeline. So the whole idea is we recognize that, it might be a good project, but it just doesn't fit with our strategic understanding of what we plan for the next 3 years or the next 5 years. Again, I think if you took this slide and you actually were to take this to your own organization and ask them, show us the concept of how projects get suggested, how they get approved, and how they actually get worked. And very importantly, show me the projects that have been rejected. If you really want to drill deeper, show me the projects that have been suggested by a member of the senior leadership team that have been rejected. Unfortunately, we have bias in our project selection process, and very often it's who suggests the project gets selected as opposed to the merit of the project. So I think that's very important that we look at that. All organizations struggle to show those type of projects. So that's the conceptual understanding of it. Practically, I think the only way you do that is you need some form of planning tool. So this is the idea here about looking at our portfolio. So we're looking across our dashboard here. So this is actually a report here taken from Project Vision, which is a tool I use. So the two tools I tend to use, like a lot of people, I use Microsoft Project Planning at the individual project level. I think it's quite powerful, it's quite flexible, but I always have issues around the reporting of that, and it's good at the project level. At a program level, at a portfolio level, I find it doesn't meet my requirements. So what I tend to do is I take this tool here, Project Vision, and I use this as my program or my portfolio level. So I think it's not a case of having one tool, it's about getting the best out of two tools and getting them to work together. So that's what I find works for me. That's the other kind. I can also look at it and I can actually suck an entire Microsoft project file back up into it, and I can look at it here in this web-based view, and I find that very powerful. That sometimes when a project's in draft mode, I like to keep it on my locked down on my laptop, and I don't want anyone looking at it until I have it ready for presentation to the wider organization. But when I do, I struggle typically to get that project off my laptop and up onto the intranet. So this is what I do here. I use the web-based interface of Project Vision, and that helps me do that. Again, part of that importance of communication. Just going to move on here just a little bit. The other thing too is I think that we have to accept that within our organization we cannot deliver everything. It is impossible to deliver good, fast and cheap. So one of the things we should try and do is we should disappoint early. We should fail early. We should tell people, no, you're not going to get it that quick, that cheap, and to that quality standard. It simply doesn't work. So essentially, if you were to actually, what is the essence of project management? If you ask me that in one sentence, I would say to you, it's to put your project in a position where you under-promise and you over-deliver. So one of the things we've got to stress is we under-promise to the organization, and then we work damn hard to make sure we over-deliver in terms of what was promised. This is just, I'm going to take a look, I'm just watching the clock here. I'm sure there's a lot of questions going to come in a little while, but I'd like to take a look at a case study. This is the closest one I have to a large-scale medical devices project. So what I have here is a global pharma company. So a lot of people will be able to relate to this. So I had 30 independent projects. So essentially it's a program of work as opposed to an individual project. I had 30 projects ranging from the introduction of new manufacturing equipment to the actual construction of a manufacturing facility. Massive scale project of this size and scale would typically take about 3 years to implement. The big challenge with this was we had to fast track the project and deliver it within 18 months. This is a big change. It's interesting for all the methodology techniques we talk about how projects are initiated and selected. The challenge with this project was that how it came about is a senior executive, while under pressure in the media interview, made a commitment that a certain product would be in clinical trials within a. When the interview ended, he or she was just as surprised as anybody else. Share price took a little spike the following day, and that was it. The organization was committed to the project. They selected a manufacturing site here in Ireland to actually execute the project, and it was a massive undertaking because this was also a huge surprise to the manufacturing side. They didn't have time to resource up and get ready for it either. So this was a massive brainstorming exercise. So I suppose the two key issues that we had to look at were how to fast track the program of work, and we also needed visibility of the resources required. So essentially that was the challenge, how to fast track, and really understanding the resources was a massive issue in terms of project success. So we had 18 months to deliver this. So a significant amount of time, and to be honest, we put a massive effort in the first couple of weeks in terms of planning effectively. We did a lot of brainstorming, and if I refer back to the whiteboard, this is one of our most successful points in the project. You can see on the left side of the screen, we're looking at how we can continue to deliver this in 50% of the time, but still meeting FDA quality and compliance requirements. And if you see on the left of my screen there in the whiteboard, we're looking at the ordering, the factory acceptance test, the delivery, the install, the equipment commissioning. And you can actually see there's quite a number of other handwritings, and this is essentially the senior leadership team in the organization all committing, rolling up their sleeves and saying we are fully committed to delivering this, even as difficult as it is. We took this whiteboard, and then when we actually took it a little bit deeper, we actually identified that this is just one of the projects, and we built this into our template. You see I'm matching the headings I had in the whiteboard: design, procurement, equipment build, factory acceptance test. This is at a high level what the different stages or phases are, or work packages that we have to deliver our project. If I drill in, you see I've got a very detailed Gantt chart, and I've got clear visibility of the commitment of all the resources. If you look to the right of any of the blue bars, you'll see, I'm just looking here at one of them, and I'm looking at I need commitment from site engineering, I need commitment from process automation, I need commitment from the maintenance department, from instrumentation. So actually what I was essentially developing here is a single version of the truth, clear visibility of what it takes to deliver your project. That's only at one of the 30 projects, so we've got to be careful not working in isolation. We also got visibility of the resources, again, at a single project level. So we're looking there, and that was quite a large project, and you're looking at about 4,000 hours in that project to deliver it. Big issue is to get program visibility. So if you actually look here, when we take all our projects into account, we're looking at a deliverable there of about 250,000 hours across the organization. What was absolutely clear when we analyzed this is our project had failed from week 6. There was not a hope in hell in us delivering this. So we actually could see this isn't going to work, and essentially what we did is we failed early. I'm a big fan of failing early. That means you're becoming realistic, you're becoming aware of what the deliverables are. So as we failed, we went back to our senior management team and we said to them, this is not going to work. We can tell you now, we don't need to wait 18 months, this project is going to fail. So essentially we went through this process that I often regard as, we recognize that you look for the project disaster ahead. So if you can see a disaster well ahead, you have time to do something about it. You can change course, you can brake, you can do something. You don't wait until you get to your head-on collision and then deal with the project disaster. And really this comes down to almost a common sense approach that whenever you have a problem, you've got to analyze it. And after you analyze it, you have to propose a solution. So essentially we had identified the problem is, how do we deliver 30 projects in 18 months that should take 3 years? We analyzed it and we became crystal clear that the deliverable is we have 250,000 hours. The solution was to go back to our senior leadership team at corporate and show them what it took to deliver. What they actually did was because we had complete transparency, they actually supported it and they gave us the commitment that whatever resources we needed we could get. So we actually went out to the market and we resourced up. What was quite a bit different to this project compared to other projects is we were brought the contractors in early. Normally what organizations do when there's a project, they bring in the resources, contractors, and they work exclusively on the project. The challenge I always see with that is that when the contractors leave, the knowledge leaves as well. So what we did in this project was we brought the contractors in early. They worked side by side with our existing technical people. As the projects came on board, the existing staff could walk off the job into a project role. As the project completed, they walked back into their business as usual job with the knowledge of the new equipment as well as the existing. So it was incredibly successful. Very pleased to say the project was delivered successfully, and it met the requirements of the organization. Both the project sponsor and the project manager got promoted to a global role, so it was incredibly successful. If I was to take a look at this and come back to these 10 knowledge areas we often hear in project management, and I said to you earlier on when we were looking at things conceptually that it's always about the softer skills, the people skills. So in this case, this project here, now I've limited to 5, I would say this was a massive undertaking in schedule management, so it would tick the box of time project. Cost actually became almost irrelevant because it was of such strategic importance to the organization they wanted to deliver. Scope, massive undertaking in actually figuring out what the full deliverable was. Quality, meeting FDA requirements was kept the whole way through. Did full visibility of the risk, and I think it was a massive undertaking in human resources. So that's an example where we're actually seeing that even on an incredibly technical project, it actually was essentially people that delivered the success of the project. So I'm a little bit conscious of the time, Tom. 1:45. Will I pause or?
Well, let's see. Why don't you pause for just a second while I encourage people to pose questions.
Okay.
John, if you have a few more slides to go through, then maybe we can do that while we're collecting questions, and then pose them, say, in a few minutes.
Yeah, I'm just I could. There's a number of case studies I would like to look at, but I will certainly follow this up at a later stage because. But certainly there's maybe I'll give people a chance, and I might move to my last slide because I think that's the takeaways of essentially what we've talked about. But certainly if people maybe take a moment for questions, and I'll maybe move to my last slide that we can actually look at it. But I will give people a copy of all the slides, even though obviously I'm not going to have time to go through all of them with you. Is that okay, Tom?
That sounds good, John. And I would ask folks to pose their questions. We're going to go to the top of the hour, and then we will stop. But if you have a question, we will pose it anonymously. So feel free to do that. And John, I'll pass the podium back to you.
Okay. So in terms, guys, I'm just going to take a little jump ahead here just for a second. I'm going to move very fast here. See, can I just kind of jump ahead? Just so many case studies with these things, but I'm just going to move ahead. And this is kind of very important here. If we were to look at takeaways from the stuff I've talked about, guys, I think if you want to reduce project failure in your organization, the first thing is you've got to look to put together an engaged and empowered project team. So we've got to give project teams the respect, the decision making that they need. We've got to trust them. We can't have project teams constantly having to go back to senior management to question and to get permission. Essentially, sometimes we've got to throw these guys the ball and let them run with it. You always have to recognize the importance of planning. Projects always take a significant upfront effort with a phased approach. You've got to adapt as you move along in terms of we got to recognize that you can't plan everything, but phase by phase, where we use our stage gate reviews and we look ahead. The next thing is you start off recognizing that all your stakeholders have a different understanding of what project success is. Essentially, we all have our own understanding of what the single version of the truth is. So I think in order to get people on board, you've got to recognize there are many versions of the truth at the beginning, but you've got to work with your stakeholders to move them from not just stakeholders, but you've got to make them team members, and part of that is recognizing that not everyone can have everything they want in terms of success in the project, but by working together, we can all have more success. In selecting your project sponsor, I think that's incredibly important. It's unfortunate the project team or the project manager never gets to select the sponsor. It's always the organization selects the sponsor. But I think that the project team should have a say in it, because essentially this is their go-to person. And what will actually happen is project sponsors will want to be selected. They'll want to be seen as a go-to person in the organization, so they'll work much harder at the role of project sponsorship. We all know incredibly important the area of stakeholder engagement. It is never too early to engage your stakeholders. You don't wait until it's a crisis point. You work in a relationship, you work in a history, and when something happens, you say, okay guys, this is a blip in the road, this is a setback, but we have a relationship, we have an understanding, and we're going to work together to manage it as best we can. Always, always, always promote internal ownership. Do not rely on consultants. If you hire external consultants, ensure there is a coaching element in the project as well. Don't have it that all that knowledge is external. You've got to bring the knowledge internally into the organization. So coaching and consultancy, I think, go hand in hand. You've got to have a project management tool. In the size of your industries, and I actually was at a medical devices conference in Berlin about 2 weeks ago and spoke to the organizations, and it's amazing what some people call a small company in medical devices. Some people had over 1,000 staff, and they said they worked for a very small company. in terms of trying to keep visibility on 1,000 resources, I think that's incredibly difficult, and I do think you need some form of project, program, or portfolio management tool. And as I said earlier on, the essence of it, you always look in your project to put yourself in a position where you will under-promise and over-deliver, and that really is the secret sauce of project management. So I'll maybe stop now just on the basis of about 10 minutes for Q&A, so I'll hand over to the audience and back to you, Tom.
Thank you, John. Thanks for that excellent run-through. That was terrific. I would encourage people to ask questions, take the time to do that. We do not have any questions at the moment, and so yours would be the first, and would welcome that. So why don't we give folks a few seconds to jot down some questions, and we'll go from there.
Perfect.
Well, John, this rarely, if ever, happens, but we do not have one question posed by the audience. So I would suggest that you take a moment or two to wrap up, and we will conclude the webinar.
Okay, great. So listen, thanks very much for people for taking the time to dial in. What I've done is I've shared the slides, and I have a number of other case studies that are available. If you would like to ask me any question at a later stage, I'm on LinkedIn, so my name is John McGrath. I'll actually include maybe a link in the slides. I'm happy to connect with people on LinkedIn. I also occasionally speak at conferences in the US, so perhaps I might meet some people at a later stage. I know there's a number of medical device conferences coming up in the States over the next 6 months. There's certainly one of them I think I'm going to be attending. So thank you very much. Delighted to
not so fast. We do have one, so why don't I pose that before we sign off here, see if there are others that come in. It says you mentioned not relying. Yes. Are you there, John?
Yeah, I'm here, yeah.
Okay. So it says you mentioned not relying on a percentage complete, but rather use EVM or milestones. How do you do this without knowing what is complete? That's the question.
Okay, so essentially, in terms of, so if we actually just take, for example, in any project management is essentially about managing variance. We always have a set of planned values and we have a set of actual values. So we have, for example, a planned start, planned finish, planned duration, planned cost, planned work. But we also have an actual start, actual cost. Really what project management is about managing your cost variance, your finish variance, your duration variance, your work variance. So percentage complete, I think, doesn't capture that. So for example, if you have an activity it's supposed to take 2 days and it's scheduled for a Monday or Tuesday, and if you get a report on Friday and you ask the question, how did you get on with that activity? And if you're told it's complete, you record the fact it's 100% complete. It doesn't actually analyze whether it took 4 days instead of 2 days, and it could have had a huge bearing on the critical path and the cost of the project. So I think percentage complete is really kind of level one. So I think if you use percentage complete, you have to, and I think a lot of people will relate to this concept that things often go to 80, 90%, and they find it very difficult to get them to go to 100% complete. So what I use is a kind of a more robust, where I essentially am using earned value management with a cost management tool, and what I'm actually looking at is the cost of my project to now, and I'm trying to analyze not only where I am now, but if the same level of expenditure was to happen. So for example, if I'm looking at a 10% overrun on my project, and if that actually continues at the same trend throughout the project, I can see that it's going to have a massive difference on the cost. But sometimes also by doing my analysis, I can actually recognize where the 10% was overspent. I can be proactive, I can do something about it, and I can actually limit that the expenditure or the cost overrun is only going to happen up to that stage gate review. So I think percentage complete is just, it's a real light touch project reporting. I think you need to look at milestones, you need to look at cost, which is earned value management, you need to look at schedule management, which is critical path analysis. So I just think that percentage complete is only one of many, and it's not enough on its own to assess a project. I've just found that any time where I see a project in crisis mode, typically it has been reporting on percentage complete, and very typically the percentage complete is a very superficial reporting. There's actually very little substance behind where the percentage complete came from. Essentially, it's not objective, and that's the problem with it. We need more objective and more robust ways of reporting.
Here's another question that's come in, John. Can you recommend a project management course for someone who is very new to project management, one that might include change management also? I'm assuming this is probably an online, a request for an online course.
Sure. Well, to be honest with you, I think there are a whole range of options that are out there. What I would encourage somebody to do like that is to actually maybe get involved with their local PMI chapter. So I think project management or any education, it's a very lonely thing, and I think you often don't learn it properly by simply doing an online course. I think it's great to do the online course where you're learning theory, but by actually going along to a project management evening, we run them here all the time in Dublin, and PMI is much bigger in the US. But essentially, by actually talking to like-minded professionals, and you get people at all levels, and essentially they run similar to what we're doing here. They run events, sometimes they're webinars, but more often than not you have a local chapter in every city, and people will actually, you can go along and you can talk to people afterwards, you can talk to the speaker. I think you can, there's a whole range of online courses you can do right from a certificate right up to an MSc or an MBA level in project management. I think you need that people interaction. If you learn it purely theoretical, I don't think it works. I find that in my own teaching as well here. I've kind of moved away from using PowerPoint as much with students, and I'm trying to actually get them to actually function as a project team where they're doing more case study type of exercises. And I think that's very difficult to do online. You really have to meet face to face to do that. So yes, online is useful, but I don't think it's enough on its own. I wouldn't like to, obviously it depends on where the person is based, but online I think would be my second preference. If I could, I would try and attend an instructor-led training session as well. If you have a requirement in your organization, I'm happy to develop a module, and I can even certify it at right up the postgraduate level. So that's actually a very good thing to do. Sometimes we do that here in the university where I teach, where we'll actually go in and we will actually take a requirement like that, and we'll build a program around it, and we'll actually roll it out, and then students will complete the course, complete a number of assessments as well. Typically it's more continuous assessment than exam driven, and the org has the benefit of having people train not in a generic project management but actually tailored to their organization, and then the participants get the benefit. They're not just doing an online course where they get a certificate, they're actually getting a certificate recognized globally by a third level university. So and I'm sure local universities in the States do that as well. So there's just the problem is really there's too much choice. That's the biggest issue. It's trying to wade through but if the person wants to send me an email afterwards, and if they have a particular course they're looking at, I'm very happy to give an objective view on what I think of the course content, etc.
John, did you put your email slide up? Do you have one that you can refer to, or just maybe tell people what your email address is?
Yeah, well, what I could do here is I'll just pop in if people want for just jump into my Word here. So there's an assessment from my students today. I just had a lecture beforehand. So you can get me at I'll just give you my college address here, john.mcgrath@dit.ie, and that will get me. And if you search for John McGrath on LinkedIn, you should find me as well. And I'm happy to chat to anyone via Skype or via email if they have a question at a later stage.
Well, that's great, and that's going to do it for our webinar today. John, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to our friends at Cora Systems for arranging this, and we'll look forward to speaking to you again through webinar or in person at one of our upcoming events at MassMEDIC. So thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you, Tom. It was a privilege. Thank you very much.